The Middle Ages, stretching roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, were marked by deep transformations in European social, political, and economic structures. Among the most defining aspects of this period were the intertwined systems of manorialism and feudalism, both of which shaped the daily lives of people and the development of centralized monarchies. Manorialism, the economic foundation of feudal society, was a system rooted in agrarian self-sufficiency and localism. Over time, however, the very stability provided by the manorial system contributed to the conditions necessary for the gradual strengthening of centralized royal authority. This essay explores the structure of manorialism, its socio-economic impacts, and how it paradoxically facilitated the rise of powerful monarchies in medieval Europe. The structure and nature of manorialism. Manorialism, often referred to as the manor system, was the organizing principle of rural economies during much of the medieval period. It was built around large estates or manors owned by lords who exercised legal and economic power over the peasants, especially the serfs who lived on their land. The manor included the lord's residence, often a fortified house or small castle, surrounding farmland, a village for the peasants, a church, and sometimes a mill or blacksmith's workshop. Serfs worked the land and, in return, were allowed to live on it and receive protection from the lord. They paid taxes or rents in kind, such as a share of their crops, and were obligated to perform various duties, such as plowing the lord's fields, repairing roads, or working in his household. In contrast to slaves, serfs were not bought and sold individually, but they were bound to the land and could not leave the manor without permission. This highly localized system created stable, self-sufficient communities that were largely isolated from external trade or political affairs. However, it also laid the groundwork for later political developments. The political and social implications of manorialism. Manorialism reinforced a rigid social hierarchy. At the top were monarchs and high-ranking nobles. Below them were lesser lords, knights, and at the bottom, peasants and serfs. Although kings were nominally the highest authority, in practice, their power was often fragmented and challenged by powerful lords who held vast estates and private armies. Within this system, manorial lords operated with significant autonomy. They administered justice, collected taxes, and often had their own militia. This decentralized power structure initially weakened monarchies, especially after the fall of the Roman Empire, when Europe splintered into smaller self-governing units. In this early medieval context, kings were often symbolic figures, unable to impose their will on the great lords who held real local power. However, as time progressed, the very nature of manorial self-sufficiency, along with developments in trade, taxation, and warfare, would enable monarchs to reassert control. The gradual centralization of power. Several factors contributed to the gradual strengthening of monarchical power in the later Middle Ages, despite the decentralized nature of manorialism. 1. Economic growth and urbanization. By the 11th and 12th centuries, Europe began to experience a modest economic revival. Improvements in agricultural techniques such as the heavy plow, three-field system, and horse collar increased productivity. Surpluses allowed peasants to engage in limited trade, giving rise to markets and towns outside the direct control of local lords. Towns, in turn, became centers of royal support. Many urban communities negotiated charters granting them special rights, often directly from the king, bypassing local lords. This fostered a new class of burghers or bourgeoisie who supported stronger royal authority as a counterbalance to feudal fragmentation. The rise of national monarchies. In countries like England and France, monarchs gradually built more effective administrative systems. In England, the Norman conquest of 1066 allowed William the Conqueror to establish a strong central government. The Domesday Book, a comprehensive land survey, gave the crown control over taxation and landholding information, key tools in consolidating authority. In France, Capetian kings slowly extended their influence by forming alliances, marrying strategically, and taking advantage of feudal inheritance laws. Over time, they brought powerful duchies and counties under their control, often using legal and religious justification for annexation. Let me know legal and administrative innovations. Monarchs also began to develop centralized legal systems that superseded local customs. Royal courts and common law in England, for instance, established the principle that the king's law was superior to that of any local lord. This undermined the judicial authority that manorial lords had traditionally enjoyed. The emergence of professional bureaucracies staffed by educated clerks and nobles loyal to the crown helped kings manage increasingly complex territories. Royal taxation systems also improved, especially as rulers found ways to extract revenue directly from towns and emerging trade routes, rather than relying solely on feudal dues. The role of the Church. The Catholic Church played a dual role in medieval politics. While it sometimes challenged royal authority, especially through the investiture controversy, it also legitimized monarchs and crowned them as divinely ordained rulers. Monarchs, in return, supported church reforms and expanded ecclesiastical institutions, further extending their ideological influence. Over time, as kings positioned themselves as defenders of the faith, they gained moral authority to centralize power. The Church also supported the establishment of order and justice, reinforcing the idea of the monarch as the guarantor of peace. Decline of manorialism and rise of strong monarchies. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the manorial system began to decline due to a combination of economic, social, and demographic factors. The Black Death, 1347 to 1351, drastically reduced the population of Europe, leading to labor shortages and increased bargaining power for peasants. Many serfs began to abandon their obligations or move to towns in search of better opportunities. Simultaneously, the monetization of the economy reduced the relevance of in-kind payments and traditional feudal duties. Lords increasingly preferred rents paid in money, and this shift made manorial organization less effective. Peasants gained more autonomy, and centralized authorities began to play a greater role in tax collection and public administration. This erosion of manorial obligations corresponded with the consolidation of royal power. As local lords lost their economic base, kings acquired more control over taxation, legal systems, and military force. National armies, often composed of mercenaries or conscripts, began to replace the feudal levy, reducing the military importance of local nobility. Case studies. England and France. In England, the centralizing efforts of monarchs such as Henry II with his legal reforms and Edward I with parliamentary institutions laid the foundations for a more unified state. Although tensions with the nobility, such as those expressed in the Magna Carta 1215, limited royal authority, they also contributed to the development of institutions that would eventually support constitutional monarchy. In France, the Hundred Years' War, 1337 to 1453, ironically strengthened the monarchy in the long term. Although initially a conflict between feudal lords, it ended with the French crown more centralized than ever, thanks to leaders like Charles II, who created a standing army and imposed permanent taxes. Manorialism was both a product and a pillar of early medieval society. Though it initially entrenched decentralized power and limited royal control, it also created the conditions necessary for the reemergence of strong monarchies. The economic stability and social order it fostered enabled towns to grow, legal systems to develop, and monarchs to consolidate their authority. By the end of the Middle Ages, manorialism had faded, but its legacy lived on in the centralized states that emerged from the medieval world. The kings of Europe, once mere figureheads in a fragmented feudal landscape, had become powerful rulers commanding armies, collecting taxes, and administering justice over increasingly unified territories. Thus, the transformation from local manorial authority to centralized monarchical rule marks one of the most significant political evolutions of the